Hi, and welcome to the Two Texts podcast. I'm here with my co-host John Andrews, and my name is David Harvey. This is a podcast of two friends from two different countries, meeting every 2 weeks to talk about the Bible. Each week we pick one text to talk about, which invariably leads us to talking about two texts, and often many more. This season we're taking a long, slow journey through the book of Acts to explore how the first Christians encountered the disruptive presence of the Holy Spirit.
Well, David, it is great to see you. Of course, our listeners listen to us, but we have the glory of technology to see each other. And it's great to see you. And of course, we're into 2025. Happy 2025 to everybody. Pray it's going to be a blessed and glorious new year, and a year in which Jesus will do something amazing in us and through us as we come.
Absolutely.
But we are back after a little break over Christmas and New Year, which was marvelous. And if our listeners can remember that far back, we had got to this explosive moment potentially where Paul has returned to Jerusalem, received a warm welcome, which was lovely. And then it all went
immediately
south pretty
followed
quickly.
by complaints.
Indeed. Oh, by the way, Paul. And so Paul was essentially that James and the elders repeated some accusations, which were groundless, of course. But then they asked Paul to engage in this oath ceremony and support for other people. And of course, we're jumping in right at the end of that. So Paul has submitted to all of that, even though he may have had a case not to submit. He shows his willingness to submit for the greater good. But we're going to jump in right at the end of that process and see what happens next. And it's a pretty explosive what happens next. So I think you're going to read for us from Acts 21, verse 27.
I am.
Yes. Okay.
So we're picking up here. Paul has submitted to the purification rites and is going to the temple to inform the temple of this period of purification. So the text reads from chapter 21, verse 27. It says, "When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, 'Fellow Israelites, help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place.' They had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with Paul, and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another. And since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, 'Get rid of him.'"
Yeah, how to make an entrance by Paul. Wow,
My
look
goodness.
at that. Incredible.
My goodness.
And a bit of like right at the end there's an unmissable sort of Jesus echo there, isn't there? Sort of get rid of him.
That.
Like it's hard to read that and not hear sort of 25, 27 years before that sort of, crucify him. We have no king but Caesar. And ironically, in sort of similar settings, they called to get rid of Jesus. Here, of course, they're calling to get rid of Paul. And ironically, it's a Roman that's saving Paul from the mob. Whereas, of course, in Jesus, a Roman handed Jesus over to the mob. So you do get this sort of lovely little echoey feel at the end of this particular episode.
I mean, what do you, if you don't mind me pushing on a little bit in that?
Yeah,
because I'm not sure how echoey, John. I mean, it depends what you mean by echoey in that sense, because I don't think our English translations always help us here. And the reason I ask is in Luke, right? When they say away with this one, right? So they the Luke 23 verse 18, the whole crowd shouted, "Away with this man, release Barabbas to us," right? And then here we have the crowd kept shouting, "Get rid of him," right? In Greek, it's exactly the same phrase. So I'm slightly irritated at the English translations for translating them differently here.
Yeah.
But in Greek, they say exactly the same thing. So English readers completely forgiven for not drawing the connection or saying, it sounds similar. I'm tempted to think, and maybe this is what you mean by an echo in that. I think Luke exactly wants us to think of this story here. Not least of all, there's also a moment where they this is the man. Right?
Yeah. Yes, indeed.
Which is also there in the text as a allusion back. So now that's a little more allusion-y, but I can't help but think that the "get rid of him, take him away" language is absolutely Luke telling you, hey, by the way, watch what's going on here. I mean, what is that? What you mean? Forgive me.
Yeah, it was really. It was the sense of there seems to be Luke drawing our attention to two very similar events, where the crowd essentially, encouraged or otherwise, want this voice silenced and want this person out of the way. And no, I think that's there. And so it was striking, just as you came to the end of the reading there, it was really striking to hear that again.
Yes.
And let's get rid of him or away with him, which is what we see there.
And I was probably just doubling down, so forgive me, listeners. But
great.
there's times where John and I will say, hey, listen, there's a bit of an illusion here. But I was pretty sure that you weren't saying this was a maybe.
Yeah.
This is Luke's big neon arrow, to take him away, and even that language is actually quite complex because. In John's gospel, which is not Luke or Acts, and obviously, but he plays quite regularly on the double meaning of take him away, which also can mean sort of lift him up or be lifted out of, which becomes another way of talking about crucifixion.
Yes.
Right? So there's a fascinating kind of potential double meaning of this word here. But, like this crowd is, they're wanting Paul's death. That's
for sure.
And Luke then wants us to see, this is what the good news of Jesus tends to do to people, isn't it?
It's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. And I think one of the things that struck me as you began to read the story was the fact that Paul was recognized by Jewish people from Asia. And even the name, Trophimus, the Ephesian. So there's clearly some. It may actually be Jews from Ephesus that have seen Paul, which strikes you again that, my goodness, Paul must have made some significant impact back in Ephesus for a group of people to spot him and recognize him. Because again, remember, Herod's temple it's a 35-acre site. It's absolutely humongous. We are assuming, because of the accusation, I don't know if you've got any more clarity on this, David, but because of the accusation, they've brought a Gentile into the temple. Of course, Gentiles were allowed in the temple, but only in the court of the Gentiles. So there was an interesting dividing wall between the court of the Gentiles and areas where only Jewish men could go, for example. So is the accusation, Paul's brought a Gentile into that area, which of course would be a terrible and stupid thing for Paul to do. And you just can't imagine Paul in his worst moments bringing a Gentile across that divide into a court only reserved for Jewish people. Even in his most maverick moments, I can't see Paul ever doing that.
Yes.
Of course, it's all baseless. Trophimus isn't actually in in the temple at this point, but because they've seen him somewhere in the city, they assume, oh, we was with Paul, so we must be here, and they make this terrible assumption. But as a little aside, it shows you the impact Paul must have had in areas like Ephesus, that he's actually recognized. These are the days before internet and photographs and smartphones. It's not like they can look his profile up on Facebook or something, but these people recognize him, which again is just a powerful insight into the influence of Christianity in the Asian world.
Yes, and I mean absolutely, it's quite significant. I mean, in one level, of course, it's possible that Paul is singularly the most famous Christian in the province of Asia. But like you say, I mean, this is happening. I mean, I think what's fascinating is you can almost rebuild the accusation as to how people, I mean, my goodness, let me interrupt myself for a second, but I'm struck, we talked about this in the last episode. I'm so struck by how this is a social commentary on how we as humans are, right? That we chase our fears rather than actuality so often of the time. And so it's whatever we're saying about Paul or what people think about Paul here, Luke wants us to see it's not true. Right? But you can kind of see how as humans they got there. So you've got this guy going around Asia proclaiming Jesus to Jew and Gentile. The net result is Jew and Gentile are eating together. You can see how a group of people would then say, you therefore see Jews and Gentiles as the same, right? Therefore, when you come to the temple with your Gentile buddy, you're probably going to take him straight into the court of the Jews because you don't see a difference between Jews and Gentiles. And which, of course, is unfair on Paul because as a Christian, he sees no difference, but he clearly is able to tell the difference between Jewish customs and Gentile customs, and isn't going to do that. But there's just enough data about Paul out there that simply being seen with the Gentile allows them to make an assumption that he has almost definitely broken the law. And this whole scene builds around ultimately people not actually telling the truth and paying attention to Paul. I mean, and there's lines in this, John. I mean, I've seen this a few times in Acts. Some in the crowd shouted one thing, some another. The commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar. I mean, that's like reading anything on the internet these days, isn't it? It's like, how often do you read something and go, I'm actually just not sure what's true anymore?
Yeah. And again, there's a beautiful Jesus echo there, isn't there? As they were sort of preparing Jesus for trial, they couldn't actually get people to agree on a story. So part of the problem was they couldn't nail enough witnesses down to say the same thing. And of course, misinformation, ambiguity, and unscrupulous people who are willing to either use the ambiguity or the misinformation for their advantage is a very dangerous tool. It's a vicious tool. And I think we're more exposed to the danger of that tool today than at any point in human history because of our accessibility to each other via internet and social media and information. And quite literally, someone could create profile and rumor, and you're just working very, very hard to just even contain that, let alone address it. In our world. So, and it gets out of control super quick. It moves from, I think Paul's in the temple to, I mean, the language is quite is staggering, isn't it? Fellow Israelites, help us. It's like help you do what? This is a single man on his own, it seems. He's sponsored 4 other men, but the implication is Paul's there. Paul feels no threat. He's been there for 7 days doing this stuff. It's not like he's just popped up today. He's been around a whole week. But of course, it's remembering, as I alluded to earlier on, Herod's temple was huge, and it's possible that you're in that and just not bump into people. It's just, we're talking hundreds of people potentially, if not thousands, milling around the temple precinct because it is vast as a precinct, but somehow they bump into him. But they clearly see him as a threat. And these rumors that James has alluded to, these accusations, have definitely gathered root.
Yes.
This man teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. My goodness. That's a fairly robust and comprehensive accusation, isn't it?
I mean, it's interesting how, like, keeping this image locked in your head that Paul is accused of these things while being at the temple. So he's accused of being a lawbreaker while being at the temple for a purification rite.
Yeah.
So Paul is quite literally performing proof of his commitment to Torah as an individual. And this is it's so telling, isn't it? That even doing that, once people have got an idea in their head, it's amazing how hard it is for them to drop that. So nothing that you're doing, Paul, is suggesting that anything we're saying is true, but we're going to keep saying those things. And essentially then, Paul is now treated as the traitor they think him to be. So he now is punished as if he's done the things which he has not done. In fact, not only has he not done them, he's gone out of his way to show that he's not interested in doing those things. This is at some level, it's so interesting to me how, as the more time we spend in this text, the more that Luke is absolutely trying to help us see that if this happens to Jesus, what hope do we have of, you know, I was thinking as we kind of backed our way into this, there's that little clue of, you know, take him away, get rid of him. Yeah. We're like, oh, that's a direct allusion to the Jesus story. But, you know, you said it, he's been around a week. You know? Jesus was in Jerusalem, right? Happily wandering around doing this thing, you know. They stir up trouble against him. I mean, you've alluded to all of this stuff, but like, I hope the listeners don't miss it. Even the very fact that Paul's being falsely accused of something he didn't actually do and say. Jesus is accused of he said he's going to destroy the temple. He said he's going to do this. Like, the whole thing is paralleling Jesus' story. And you've got people doing what people do, which is, if we can just take our anger out on who we see to be something or someone that almost can't defend themselves against our anger. So it becomes irrelevant so quickly in this story that Paul did not do what is accused of him. That actually ceases to become a factor of the story. They now are just taking out their fear and anxiety on Paul, right? It's that now we're worried about what this gospel is doing to our people. We're worried about what this means for our identity and our behavior. So we're now just beating you up, right? And at some level, there's an extent to which it's almost this mob catharsis that we will just feel better about ourselves if we beat you up. And I see this in things that are done to damage people in public. When eventually the dust settles, everybody realizes nothing has changed. Like, nothing's actually been fixed. Like, if this mob kill Paul, they've not solved the problem. No. It's just for a very few moments, we feel a little better because we took our anger out on something. I mean, you kind of catch what I'm trying to articulate there. It's a very human thing, but it's very broken, isn't it?
Oh, it's very broken. It's very broken, and I think if you want to carry the connection between Jesus and Paul a little bit further, there was a sense in which in the gospel it feels like an agenda had Jesus silenced.
Yes,
at least at a human level, you know, they were not to know that the one silence would rise from the dead 3 days later and never be silenced. But there was an agenda to silence him. And then now we've got, you know, a couple of decades later, you've got almost exactly the same type of agenda trying to silence the gospel again. So I know it's Jesus and I know it's Paul, but it's almost like it's a commentary even on the spread of the gospel. This thing has come around again. You silenced Jesus the first time. Now you're trying to silence the gospel the second time round, and it is and of course there's a terrible irony that for me, when you project this forward, that eventually the very place where this is taking place will ultimately be destroyed and literally silenced. That temple will find itself turned to rubble in AD 70, and all worship, all noise, all expression of praise, all reading of Torah will cease in that place because of the silence that comes on it. And it's once you end up with an agenda that doesn't seem to have any significant reasoning or rationale behind it, it's to silence that voice. And there's an opportunity here to hear that voice. Now, ironically, because of the Roman intervention, this voice gets heard, and an amazing sort of apologetic is presented through Paul's testimony, which we might get to. But there is this just insatiable desire: silence the voice, the voice, and it is quite scary to look at. It's quite scary to think that probably all of the people, and to quote the NIV, who were trying to kill him, were good people.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? I mean, we're not talking about some sort of criminal gang here. We're not talking about sort of organized thuggery. We're talking about good people who turned up that day.
Yes. To
worship Yahweh, to worship the Lord. And by the end of that day, they're trying to kill another human.
Yes.
Now, they will feel justified for that act of violence, and that's a big conversation that people can have. But that's how quickly it can turn. That a bunch of people got up that morning, were going to the temple to worship the one true God, and by the end of the day, were trying to kill a human being in the name of that one true God, even though none of that made sense. So for me, it's always, I know we've talked about before the psychology of mobs and crowds, but it's always slightly terrifying to see how quickly people can be turned or manipulated or driven by agenda or fear. And I think there's a whole bunch of things in the mix here that are driving a mob against Paul. And, there's no ambiguity here. Trying to kill him.
Yes.
They're not just trying to beat him up and give him a hard time. They want him dead.
Yes. And notice as well, I mean, here's the lesson. I don't think this is lost on Luke. Eventually who they end up reaching out for help from is the Roman Empire.
Yes.
So there's a couple of things that strike me about this. Number one, that, when we turn on ourselves in this way and forget the call of God, we actually end up in a much worse bind than we started out in, right? So now the very people that we know, I mean, we're in the temple here. So we've got the, just to make sure everybody tracks with this, this is the Roman commander who is stationed at the temple. There's not a single Jew in Jerusalem at this point that wants the Roman guard in the temple, right? This was, if you read the history books, this was a huge issue of contention amongst Pilate and the Jewish people and any of the Roman governors that were placed in Jerusalem. That the Romans realized if there's going to be trouble in Jerusalem, it's going to happen at the temple. So they wanted to put a barracks in the temple, which, as you can imagine, went up like a lead balloon in terms of its popularity. So there was always this nature of how do we handle where we put Roman soldiers in there. So they are decisively the figure of the enemy, and yet they become the people who come in to solve the problem for them. This is deeply complex in terms of the sort of human psychology that we end up selling out to something worse than that which we feared, right? I couldn't help but think about, I don't think this illusion is being, well, let me be cautious. I can't say confidently that Luke intends this illusion, but this is a biblical theme. You think of, You think of the prophets, think of Isaiah saying to the Israelites, like, so your plan is to go to Egypt for help? Like that,
Yeah.
that sort of ludicrous notion that you would go and get help from the people. There's a sense in which Scripture is aware of this failing in the human heart, that when we get angry or afraid about something, we actually start making ludicrous decisions. Like Isaiah's point to the, like of all the people that we as Israel would turn to for help, we'd go to the Egyptians, the people that our whole story is built on escaping, right? And here we're so terrified by Paul, we're happy to take the Romans' help. But here's the danger, and we'll see this perhaps in the next episode. The Roman has no idea what's going on, right? He's like, are you that Egyptian that's starting a revolt, right? Like, so the Roman is just coming in with power and aggression and taking power from everybody. And everybody's giving it up quite happily because this is how angry we are at Paul.
Yeah.
And like, my goodness, John, it's a commentary on us, isn't it?
It is totally, and yet there's a gorgeous, as I reflected there on this lovely moment, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city in Jerusalem was in uproar, and of course he intervenes, and you get this wonderful, wonderful providential moment where the intervention of Romans into the temple creates a platform for the good news to be heard. So again, that step back at a macro level, and I don't want to overcook this and don't want this to be heard the wrong way. So don't hear what I'm not saying here, but it's almost like what an enemy meant to hurt and destroy the voice. God goes, he flips it round through the providential intervention of Romans. And ironically then, as we'll see probably in an episode or two, Paul's voice gets heard.
Yes.
And Paul gets to speak, not only to the Romans, but Paul gets to speak to the crowd in a fairly dramatic way and manages miraculously to sort of say some stuff before the crowd goes bonkers again.
Yeah.
So I love the So you've got, if me and you were there just witnessing this, it's just madness.
Yeah.
Good people are losing their mind. And I say that in the loosest way. I don't mean that. I don't mean that in a psychological. I just mean that they've lost their sense of bearings. They're now throwing dust up in the air. They're trying to kill this man. There's all sorts of chaos going on. Next thing, the Romans are marching in, bashing people over the head to get this Egyptian terrorist, this Egyptian assassin, actually in the Greek, which is amazing. This dagger man. They're sort of moving in to rescue this Egyptian assassin, but actually providentially creating an opportunity for the gospel. And I love that. And I think we've got to keep reminding ourselves that in a world where sometimes agendas or attitudes or ideologies seem to be absolutely blindly raging against the voice of God in our world and against the voice of Jesus in our world. And sometimes it seems relatively successful in raging against that voice and trying to silence the voice of Jesus into their world. I'm encouraged by all the time there is this providential hand of the Lord at work. And he is maneuvering things. And just providentially, there happened to be some Romans aware that what was going on from the Fortress Antonia. And they come down, sweep in. And what looks like now a worse situation, it seems the Holy Spirit, the disruptive presence of the Spirit, creates an opportunity for the gospel to be heard. And I want to keep encouraging myself with that. We are not simply at the mercy of the mob.
Yes.
We are not simply at the mercy of the ideologies and enemies around the voice of Jesus, but actually there is always the hand of the Lord at work providentially, maneuvering his voice to be heard, even through the most unusual allies and the most unusual opportunities. And again, there is one final parallel. I think there's a little parallel in back to Jesus. Pilate stands forth and he does say, behold the man, or this is the man. he does say, I find nothing, there's no accusation in him. It's almost, although Pilate capitulates, there's almost an opportunity for the voice to be heard both to Pilate and ultimately to the crowd. And you get that lovely little, even in this terrible, catastrophic moment for Jesus, the voice of the gospel is heard. And even in this terrible, catastrophic moment for Paul, where he's within an inch of being marmalized by this crowd, the voice gets heard.
I was thinking about, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently, pastorally, but I would almost, when you were talking just there, I've been phrasing like this, that God is not held hostage by history. And I think that, because what you've said is so good, I just want to make sure people don't miss it. And it's so nuanced that it's important, that a bad theology says those bad things have happened to you because God's trying to do something good, right? And I think that's a bad theology because it has God making those bad things happen to you so that those bad things happen. Another bad theology is bad things just happen, right? Right? And actually that will leave you victim to the hands of fate. Right?
Yeah.
I think the sovereignty of God is what Joseph says to his brothers.
Yeah.
What you intended for bad, the Lord has made good, right? So that doesn't mean, that bad thing that happened, therefore now must be spoken of as a good thing, right? Yeah. No, it was never good for Joseph's brothers to do what they did to Joseph, right? Yeah. But the Lord will not be held hostage by history.
Yeah.
He has a good plan for Joseph, so that good plan will come into effect. And I think that, I think, John, I think that's the right way to read these things, is that, many of our listeners will have had terrible things happen to them in their life, horrible accusations said about potential violence he's done against them. Did God want any of those things to happen? Of course not. That's not the way of God. But what I love about what you've said is, but that's not necessarily the end of the story, right? That God does not leave us hostage to those things, and that those things can even become the spaces that good things happen, even though they were definitely bad things that would happen. And that's, if I'm echoing, please tell me if I'm not echoing you back correctly, but that's what you're saying is so beautifully about this passage here, is that no one's saying that it's good that Paul gets beat up. No one's saying that it's good that the crowd have literally turned to chaos. But watch how Paul holds space for the Lord to still make this a good thing. And I think that's part of the beauty of the gospel. Bear in mind the death of Jesus is how we are saved. So that's it for this episode. We know that there's always more to explore, and we encourage you to dive into the text and do that. If you liked this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you rated, reviewed, or shared it. We also appreciate all of our listeners who financially support the show, sharing the weight of producing this podcast. If you'd like to support the show, visit twotexts.com. But that is all for now, so until next time, from John and I, goodbye.